Medieval shields didn't come from stores, they were hand-built, and getting it wrong didn't just ruin your day, it could split your skull wide open. That's the brutal truth behind medieval shield making, a craft where every chip of wood, every drop of glue, and every iron nail stood between life and death on bloody battlefields. Forget factories, forget machines, and definitely forget walking down to your local blacksmith for a ready-made shield. Medieval warriors had to create their own defenses from nothing but raw materials wrested from nature itself. And if you've ever wondered how medieval shields were made, prepare to see wooden planks and cowhide in a way you'll never forget. This wasn't just medieval craftsmanship, it was survival history at its rawest. And understanding it might change how you look at every plank of wood you've ever touched. In the age of medieval warfare, when swords clanged and arrows screamed through the air, a shield was more than a piece of wood. It was medieval life insurance, and one mistake in building it could turn a warrior into an easy kill. So, how did they do it? How did they transform towering trees into weapons of defense, capable of stopping spears, swords, and crossbow bolts designed to puncture steel? What secrets did medieval shield makers know that could mean the difference between coming home in glory or dying face down in mud? In this deep dive into DIY medieval shield building, we're going to uncover every step, from choosing the perfect tree in the frozen winter forests to boiling cattle bones for glue and hammering red-hot iron into deadly domes known as shield bosses. You'll discover why medieval people didn't just slap boards together, why the timing of tree cutting mattered, and how rawhide became the medieval equivalent of duct tape, but tougher, meaner, and able to stop a sword in mid-swing. So buckle up, because by the end of this journey, you'll never look at medieval weapons or a simple wooden board the same way again. When it came to medieval shield making, the journey didn't start in a workshop. It began deep in silent, frost-bitten forests, where towering trees stood like ancient guardians of survival history. And the choice of wood could mean the difference between stopping a sword stroke and ending up bleeding in the dirt. Because medieval warriors weren't just craftsmen, they were betting their lives on medieval woodworking secrets that modern DIY warriors can barely imagine. And if you've ever wondered why medieval shields were made from certain trees and not others, brace yourself, because this isn't just craft, it's medieval life insurance written in rings of timber. Shield makers were picky, almost obsessively so, hunting for the perfect wood because medieval craftsmanship demanded more than any random oak or pine you might chop down on a whim. And here's the kicker. Lindenwood, also known as basswood, was the undisputed champion of medieval shield making. Praised for being lightweight, yet surprisingly tough. Nature's answer to medieval bubble wrap, except it didn't just cushion blows. It literally stopped sharp iron from slicing through to your flesh. While poplar came in as a worthy runner-up, offering fine grain and shock-absorbing powers that made it the secret weapon of those who couldn't afford basswood. But choosing the right tree was only half the battle, because medieval shield makers knew that even the best wood could betray you if cut at the wrong time. Which is why they ventured into the forest only in winter, when sap retreated deep into the roots, leaving the wood drier, lighter, and far less likely to warp or crack under pressure. Because imagine forging your perfect DIY medieval shield, only for it to split like a cheap chocolate sword the moment a spear slams into it. That's a medieval tragedy no warrior wanted to face. Every log was inspected like precious treasure. Shield makers scouring trunks for straight grain and freedom from knots, knowing that one twisted fiber could turn a shield into kindling in the heat of medieval warfare. And instead of sawing logs like modern carpenters, they split them along natural grain lines using iron wedges and wooden mallets, preserving the raw strength of the wood's fibers, because medieval shield building wasn't just crafting, it was engineering under life or death stakes. And one wrong move could mean a shield that cracked wide open on the first clash of swords. So next time you see a tree, remember medieval warriors saw potential shields, and every axe strike was a gamble with destiny. But this was only the beginning, because even perfect wood was worthless. unless you could shape it into something strong enough to survive battle. And that's exactly where we're headed next. Into the raw, muscle-burning art of transforming these seasoned planks into the shield's true form. Once medieval shield makers had split and seasoned their precious timber, the real battle began not on the field, but in workshops echoing with the scrape of steel and the sharp tang of fresh-cut wood, because medieval shield making wasn't just about owning the right materials. It was about taming them into weapons of defense through medieval woodworking so precise it could decide whether you lived to see another dawn. And if you've ever thought medieval shields were just flat boards slapped together, think again. Because every inch of a DIY medieval shield was a feat of engineering, shaped by tools that might look primitive to modern eyes, but were lethal in skilled hands. And here's where things got serious. The medieval craftsman's ultimate weapons weren't swords or spears, they were draw knives and adzes, with the draw knife being a curved blade wielded like medieval extreme shaving gear, gripped by handles on both ends. Pulled toward the chest as it peeled away stubborn high spots and splinters from the split wood, each stroke echoing like a whisper of survival history. And a slip with that blade wasn't just a nick on the wood, it could slice into muscle, turning woodworking into a blood sport. Then there was the adze, a terrifying hybrid of axe and chisel, with its blade bent at a menacing 90-degree angle, allowing craftsmen to gouge out wood with surgical precision and the nerve of a gambling man placing his life savings on a single roll of dice. Because removing too much wood meant a shield so thin it would shatter like a clay plate under a sword blow, while leaving it too thick would create a medieval tank so heavy no warrior could lift it, let alone fight behind it. And shaping the curve of round shields or the elongated taper of Norman kite shields demanded total mastery over the grain of the wood, working with its natural flow rather than hacking across it. Because medieval craftsmanship wasn't about brute force, it was about reading the hidden language of every fiber, feeling where the wood wanted to bend and where it might snap. And, as if that wasn't stressful enough, medieval shield making involved joining multiple planks into one solid surface. Typically, 3 or 4 boards carefully glued edge to edge using animal hide glue boiled down from cattle bones and hooves until it turned into a sticky medieval elixir stronger than any modern glue gun. But with one nasty catch, it began setting within minutes of cooling, leaving craftsmen racing the clock because hesitation wasn't just inconvenient. It could ruin weeks or even months of painstaking work. And here's where medieval ingenuity shone. Because without fancy clamps from your local hardware store, they piled heavy stones atop glued planks or wrapped them in tight rope tourniquets twisted with wooden levers, creating medieval pressure systems worthy of an engineering textbook. And the entire process demanded flawless timing, steady hands, and nerves of iron, because a glue joint failure was like a broken promise it could bring the entire shield crashing down in the heat of medieval warfare. And it's wild to think that medieval shield makers were essentially crafting survival equipment with the precision of a modern aerospace engineer. Except their lives and the lives of warriors on the front lines depended on getting it right. Because in medieval combat, a shield wasn't just a piece of gear. It was often the only thing standing between a warrior and a blade aimed straight for his ribs. But even after all this work, a medieval shield wasn't ready to face swords and arrows just yet, because before it could stand up to the chaos of medieval warfare, it still needed reinforcements capable of taking punishing blows and surviving the brutal physics of battle. And that's exactly where we're heading next. Into the unforgiving world of medieval shield reinforcement and the secret weapons that turned simple wood into the ultimate defensive tool. Even after medieval shield makers had painstakingly shaped and glued those precious boards into the form of a medieval shield, the job was far from over, because raw wood alone couldn't survive the violent physics of medieval combat, where swords smashed, axes hacked, and spears crashed like medieval missiles. And that's why the next critical step in medieval shield making was reinforcement, the ultimate test of medieval craftsmanship, where every choice determined whether a shield became a trusted guardian or splintered kindling in the dirt. And if you're picturing medieval shields as flimsy wooden discs, Prepare to have your mind blown, because medieval shield reinforcements were pure genius, starting with the shield rim, a part that took an ungodly amount of punishment in battle, as blades glanced off edges or warriors slammed shields together like battering rams. And without protection, shield edges cracked faster than fresh bread in a starving army camp. Which is why rawhide became the medieval duct tape of choice. Its untanned leather still strong and flexible enough to wrap tightly around curved edges, secured with tiny iron nails driven with the precision of medieval surgeons. Because in medieval shield making, every nail was more than hardware. It was a potential lifesaver. But rawhide wasn't the only option for rim defense, because iron rim strips offered hardcore protection. Albeit with a catch, they added significant weight, turning a medieval shield from a nimble defender into a medieval manhole cover strapped to your arm. So blacksmiths had to hammer iron bars flat, shape them to the shield's unique contours, and nail them down with carefully spaced holes to avoid splitting the wood beneath. And then there was the mighty shield boss, a dome-shaped piece of metal that wasn't just decorative, it was the medieval equivalent of an airbag, protecting the hand grip and deflecting incoming thrusts away from the bearer's body. And making a boss wasn't exactly a walk in the medieval park, because it required blacksmiths to hammer flat iron sheets hundreds of times, stretching them into perfect domes without creating weak spots. Because a misshaped boss didn't just look sloppy, it could throw off the entire balance of the shield, turning it into a clumsy, life-threatening liability in combat. And these bosses had to be mounted dead center, typically anchored with 4 to 6 symmetrical rivets to avoid awkward handling that could mean the difference between blocking a sword blow and catching it in your ribcage. And some medieval shields even flaunted metal studs across their surfaces, not just for intimidation but for extra defensive strength, sending a crystal-clear message that the warrior behind the shield wasn't planning to run away from trouble anytime soon, and because medieval shields were more than just wood and metal. Craftsmen also installed wooden crossbars across the back to keep the shield from flexing too much under brutal impacts, distributing force evenly like a medieval shock absorber. Because in medieval warfare, a shield wasn't simply a piece of gear, it was the thin line between life and bloody oblivion. And every rivet, every joint, and every piece of iron had to be perfect, because one loose fitting could spell disaster in the chaos of battle. But even the strongest reinforcements couldn't protect the wooden core from weather, weapon strikes, and daily wear, which meant the shield's journey wasn't finished yet, because before it could face the fury of medieval combat, it still needed an outer skin tough enough to hold the whole masterpiece together. And that's exactly what comes next, where cloth, leather, and medieval glue transform raw timber into a canvas of survival and identity. Even after medieval shield makers had reinforced their masterpieces with iron rims and bosses strong enough to deflect swords and spears, the raw wooden core of a medieval shield was still dangerously vulnerable to the relentless punishment of medieval warfare, harsh weather, and the sheer wear and tear of survival history. And that's why the next crucial chapter in medieval shield making was covering the shield's surface, because without this protective skin, a shield was basically just fancy kindling waiting to splinter apart under the crushing impact of axes and maces. And here's where medieval craftsmanship elevated itself from pure functionality to a bold statement of identity and intimidation. Because medieval shield covering wasn't simply about protection, it was about transforming wood and leather into a warrior's personal billboard visible across the chaos of battlefields. And if you think medieval shields were just painted planks, think again. Because covering a medieval shield was an art form that demanded speed, precision, and a touch of medieval madness, starting with linen, the fabric of choice across much of medieval Europe, prized for being strong, lightweight, and resistant to tearing under stress. But cutting linen wasn't exactly a casual affair, because slicing the fabric wrong was worse than cutting your hair crooked. Since hair grows back, but linen ruined by a shaky blade stayed ruined, and medieval shield makers heated fresh batches of animal glue in clay pots, carefully balancing the temperature to keep it liquid without scorching it into useless gunk. because the glue's consistency had to be perfect, too thick, and it wouldn't spread evenly, too thin, and it held about as well as wet parchment. And this process wasn't exactly forgiving, because hot hide glue began setting within minutes of cooling, forcing craftsmen to spread it quickly over the shield's surface while steam rose like medieval witchcraft. Then press linen into place, smoothing out air bubbles and wrinkles as fast as humanly possible. Because any mistake here meant a medieval shield that looked like a crumpled rag instead of a symbol of battlefield glory. And for shields destined for the brutal front lines, rawhide coverings provided a hardcore upgrade, soaked in warm water until pliable, then stretched tight over the wooden surface. But it was a delicate balancing act, because rawhide too wet would shrink like a terrified turtle, while rawhide too dry would crack like medieval parchment left in the sun. And for the elite warriors and noble knights who demanded the absolute pinnacle of medieval shield making, cuir bouilli or boiled leather became the premium choice, hardened to near metal toughness yet still lighter than iron, offering a slick surface that could deflect blows and turn enemy swords aside in battle. And once the shield was fully wrapped and dried, the medieval magic continued with decoration. Because shields were more than weapons, they were living banners, painted with symbols that proclaimed family honor, religious devotion, and warnings to anyone who dared attack. Starting with gesso, a white primer of powdered chalk and animal glue, smoothed until it shone like polished ivory, creating the perfect canvas for medieval shield painting. And colors themselves carried deep meaning, with red screaming of martial prowess and the willingness to spill blood, gold signifying wealth and divine favor, blue revealing loyalty and truth, and black whispering of grief, death, and a warrior's determination to fight until the end. While lions roared of courage, eagles soared with divine authority, and dragons signaled mystical protection. Because medieval shield painting wasn't just decoration, it was a medieval social media feed, broadcasting who you were and why enemies should think twice before crossing your path. And this dance of art and survival history demanded painters with skill rivaling monks illuminating sacred texts, because one sloppy brushstroke could ruin weeks of work, and every detail had to stay visible even in low light, pouring rain, and the swirling dust of medieval warfare. But no matter how breathtaking the paintings, a medieval shield was worthless if a warrior couldn't hold it properly in the chaos of battle. And that leads us straight into the next critical secret of medieval shield making, the hidden world of grips, straps, and the medieval engineering that decided whether a shield was a wall of protection or an accidental death trap strapped to your arm. While medieval shield makers poured endless skill into choosing perfect wood, hammering bosses, and painting symbols of power, all that craftsmanship would mean nothing if the warrior behind the shield couldn't hold it properly when swords clashed and arrows screamed through the chaos of medieval warfare. Because in the brutal world of medieval combat, a shield wasn't simply a slab of wood, it was an extension of the warrior's arm. And getting the grip system right was a matter of survival history where the margin for error was thinner than a knife's edge. And here's the mind-blowing truth. Medieval shield making offered two primary grip systems, each with its own advantages, dangers, and secret medieval engineering that modern DIY shield makers often overlook, starting with the center grip, the OG design for medieval shields, featuring a single horizontal handle mounted directly behind the metal boss, which turned a shield into a sort of medieval brass knuckle with coverage. Because gripping a center handle allowed warriors to punch forward, pivot the shield to deflect blows from any angle, or even smash opponents' faces with the boss itself, delivering a medieval sucker punch capable of breaking bones and spirits alike. But while center grips offered amazing offensive options and fast maneuvering, they demanded pure arm strength, forcing a fighter to bear the entire weight of the shield in his hand. And after minutes or hours of swinging swords and fending off spear thrusts, even the strongest arms could burn out, leaving a warrior defenseless at the worst possible moment. Which is why medieval craftsmanship evolved into the arm strap system, or an arms, a brilliant upgrade that distributed weight across the entire forearm instead of dumping it all onto the wrist and fingers, transforming the shield from a heavy club into a balanced defensive wall strapped securely against the body. And these leather straps weren't just slapped onto wood like medieval afterthoughts. They were engineered with careful placement along the vertical axis of the shield, with primary inarms anchored just below the elbow to carry most of the load, and secondary straps fine-tuned for balance, because medieval shield making was nothing if not meticulous. And leather choice mattered too, with cowhide delivering excellent durability, yet stiffening in winter's icy grip, while deerhide remained supple across seasons, but wore out faster under the savage punishment of medieval combat, and attaching these inarms demanded riveting, stitching, and reinforcement patches to spread the strain and prevent catastrophic blowouts mid-battle. Because in medieval warfare, losing a strap meant losing your shield and possibly your head, and as battles raged on, medieval shield makers knew comfort wasn't a luxury, but a tactical advantage. Which is why some shields featured wool or linen padding around the grips, turning the inside of the shield into a medieval cushion capable of softening bone-crunching impacts, while handle wrappings of leather or cord provided extra traction to keep sweaty palms from betraying a warrior at the worst possible instant. And the choice between center grip and inarms wasn't purely technical. It reflected regional traditions, with Scandinavian warriors clinging fiercely to center grips long after Southern Europe had adopted arm strap systems, proving that medieval shield making wasn't just craftsmanship, it was a tapestry of culture, tactics, and raw survival instincts woven across centuries. But even with the perfect grip, a medieval shield was only as good as the warrior who wielded it, because understanding how to use it in real combat was the final piece of the puzzle. And that's exactly where we're headed next. Into the art of turning shields into life-saving tools amid the thunder and blood of medieval warfare. Even after all the painstaking medieval shield making, from selecting the perfect winter-cut lindenwood to hammering bosses and engineering flawless grip systems, the true test of a medieval shield came not in the workshop, but on the roaring fields of medieval warfare, where the air was thick with screaming arrows, clanging steel, and the raw terror of survival history unfolding in real time. Because no matter how beautifully crafted a shield was, it became either a lifesaver or a worthless slab of wood the moment it faced the deadly dance of medieval combat. And if you've ever wondered how medieval shields were actually used in battle, buckle up. Because the secrets behind medieval shield tactics reveal just how genius and brutal medieval warfare really was, starting with one of the shield's most crucial jobs, defending against arrows. Because medieval shields weren't merely wooden barriers, they were medieval airbag systems, turning lethal arrows into harmless sticks, clattering harmlessly off curved surfaces. And while hunting arrows could usually be stopped cold by the shield's layered construction, bodkin points, those vicious, narrow tips designed to pierce armor, posed a much nastier problem, concentrating immense force onto tiny points capable of punching through any weak spot in a shield's design. And crossbow bolts were a nightmare all their own, hitting shields with bone-crushing impact like iron hornets determined to ruin a warrior's day. Which is why medieval shield-making wasn't just an art, it was a constant arms race against evolving medieval weapons technology. And when combat closed to sword's length, medieval shields showed their true versatility, because slashing attacks, while flashy and terrifying, often glanced off the shield's surface, especially if angled properly. But thrusting attacks were another story entirely, focusing raw force into pinpoint stabs that could crack through the wooden core if the shield wasn't crafted with perfect glue joints and flawless grain alignment. And facing spears and lances introduced yet another deadly dilemma, because the sheer length of those weapons allowed attackers to generate enormous kinetic energy, making direct hits catastrophic, which forced shield bearers to learn the subtle art of deflecting rather than blocking, turning an enemy's strength against them by angling the shield so blades and points slid harmlessly off rather than burying themselves deep into wood and flesh. And here's where medieval shield handling reached peak brilliance. Because a good shield wasn't just defensive, it was an offensive weapon too. capable of smashing into an opponent's face with the boss like a medieval battering ram, hooking enemy weapons aside, or even slamming into foes to break their balance and open them up for a killing blow, transforming the shield from mere protection into a devastating extension of the warrior's will. And this offensive potential wasn't optional. It was often the only thing standing between a medieval warrior and an early grave. Because medieval warfare wasn't a polite exchange of sword taps. It was chaos, blood, and brute physics. And a shield had to be light enough for rapid movement, yet strong enough to absorb blow after blow without cracking. Which is why even a few extra pounds could mean the difference between holding the line or collapsing under sheer fatigue as muscles burned and breath came in ragged gasps. And while modern people might think of shields as cumbersome relics, in medieval combat, they were as essential as a sword or spear, turning deadly blows into glancing strikes and transforming ordinary men into warriors who could survive the unthinkable. But even the finest medieval shields eventually succumbed to damage from relentless combat, punishing weather, and sheer passage of time. And that's why the final chapter of medieval shield making takes us into the equally fascinating world of repair, recycling, and how nothing in the medieval world was ever wasted, not even a broken shield that once stood between life and death. Even the most perfectly crafted medieval shields, forged through blood, sweat, and survival history, couldn't escape the brutal truth that medieval warfare was merciless to everything it touched, because once swords clanged, maces slammed, and arrows thudded like wooden thunder, even the toughest medieval shield eventually cracked, splintered, or warped under the relentless punishment of combat. And that's where the final chapter of medieval shield making stepped in: the gritty, ingenious world of medieval shield repair and recycling. Because in a world without modern factories or endless supplies, medieval craftsmen and warriors became masters of stretching every resource until it screamed for mercy. And if you've ever wondered how medieval people repaired a DIY medieval shield after it got battered in the heat of medieval combat, get ready, because this was where medieval craftsmanship and pure survival instinct collided, starting with minor surface damage. Like linen coverings sliced by glancing sword blows, which could often be patched with fresh fabric glued over the wound, creating visible mends that didn't just restore functionality, but told silent stories of past battles, like medieval battle scars etched into wood and cloth. And when leather coverings split or tore, shield makers soaked new pieces of rawhide or leather, stretching and gluing them into place like medieval surgeons performing battlefield triage. Because losing your shield's protective skin was almost as dangerous as losing your armor. But not all wounds were so easily healed, because when a wooden core cracked, things got deadly serious, demanding medieval repair techniques that would terrify modern DIY enthusiasts, such as forcing hot hide glue deep into splits and clamping the wood until the adhesive cured. Because in medieval shield making, glue wasn't just glue. It was the medieval equivalent of a second chance at life. But even then, some shields were simply too far gone. And that's when medieval resourcefulness shone brightest. Because throwing away a broken shield was unthinkable in a world where iron was worth more than some people's homes. And cracked shield planks were reborn as tool handles, furniture parts, or even pieces of fortifications. While iron bosses, rim strips, and metal studs were salvaged, melted down, or reshaped into new weapons, nails, or vital hardware for other medieval projects, proving that medieval people didn't just recycle, they elevated recycling into an art form, turning shattered remnants of war into new lifelines for survival history. And sometimes shields with epic battle damage were kept as trophies or donated to churches, becoming silent witnesses to the ferocity of medieval warfare and monuments to fallen warriors whose courage deserved to be remembered. Because in medieval society, nothing was wasted. And everything from a splintered shield plank to a bent iron boss held value if you had the skill and imagination to give it a second life. But as impressive as medieval recycling was, it only highlights the deeper truth that every medieval shield carried not just the weight of wood and iron, but the weight of the lives it protected. And that's why, As we reach the end of our journey into medieval shield making, it's time to step back and see the bigger picture. Because medieval shields were far more than defensive tools. They were symbols of identity, artistry, and the indomitable human will to survive against impossible odds. And that's exactly the legacy we'll uncover as we draw this epic tale to a close. When you step back and look at the entire staggering journey of medieval shield making, from venturing into frozen forests to choose the perfect linden tree, to hammering bosses that could save a warrior's life, to painting vibrant symbols of identity and honor, you realize medieval shields were so much more than mere slabs of wood. They were the ultimate blend of survival history, artistry, and raw medieval warfare ingenuity. Because every curve, every grain of timber, and every splash of pigment carried the weight of life and death on the battlefield. And if you've been wondering how medieval shields were made, what makes them one of the most fascinating marvels of medieval craftsmanship, and why they deserve their place in the story of medieval weapons and medieval combat, the answer lies in the staggering combination of human determination and sheer creative genius poured into every single step of their creation. Because medieval shield making wasn't just carpentry, it was high-stakes engineering under the shadow of swords and spears, where the price of failure wasn't embarrassment, but blood soaking into muddy soil. And what's incredible is how medieval shield makers transformed natural resources into life-saving works of art. Whether it was split logs turned into laminated boards strong enough to deflect crossbow bolts, or hide glue boiled from cattle bones becoming the invisible force holding survival history together, and every choice, from the angle of the grain to the thickness of rawhide edges, represented centuries of hard-earned wisdom handed down through generations. And yet, despite all this meticulous craftsmanship, medieval shields were more than physical objects. They were living stories, carried into battle to protect not only flesh and bone, but the names, crests, and legacies of entire families, towns, and kingdoms, because on medieval battlefields, swirling with chaos and death, your shield wasn't just your defense, it was your name, your status, and your last desperate prayer for another sunrise. And even after the clash of war faded, medieval shields remained powerful symbols of courage and identity, sometimes preserved as trophies or donated to churches, serving as silent reminders that medieval warfare was as much about the human spirit as it was about weapons. Because these shields tell us something timeless about who we are, that even in the most violent ages, people still sought beauty, meaning, and connection, pouring creativity into the tools that kept them alive. And perhaps that's why, even now, the art and science behind how medieval shields were made continues to captivate us, fueling everything from DIY medieval shield projects to blockbuster medieval movies, reminding us that craftsmanship, ingenuity, and the will to survive are eternal human truths. And if this journey has taught us anything, it's that medieval shield making is a shining testament to human resilience, proving that even in the harshest times, people fought not just for survival, but to leave behind something that mattered. And as we wrap up this dive into medieval shield making, one truth remains clear. A medieval shield wasn't merely a barrier against blades, it was a piece of living history, a canvas of human creativity, and the ultimate symbol of the thin line between life and death. And who knows, maybe next time we'll dive into how medieval swords were crafted to clash against these shields, revealing yet another thrilling chapter of survival history waiting to be uncovered. So now that we've journeyed through the extraordinary world of medieval shield making, peeling back every layer from raw timber hacked in frozen forests to the fierce artistry of medieval shield painting, and witnessed how each shield wasn't just a piece of medieval craftsmanship, but a lifeline in medieval warfare. The question is, what do we do with all this survival history knowledge today? Because while we might not be facing sword-wielding knights charging us down a battlefield, the spirit behind medieval shield making still resonates in a world that's obsessed with DIY projects, historical reenactments, and rediscovering the secrets of how medieval weapons and medieval combat shaped human destiny. And whether you're a hardcore history geek, a medieval enthusiast planning to build your own DIY medieval shield, or someone simply fascinated by how medieval shields were made, there's something timelessly magnetic about the idea that people once built life-saving technology with nothing but hand tools, raw materials, and a relentless will to survive. And maybe, just maybe, there's a lesson for us in that. A reminder that craftsmanship, ingenuity, and attention to detail can mean the difference between success and failure. Because in medieval times, mistakes didn't cost money. They cost blood, and understanding how medieval shields turned wood, leather, and iron into protection against the chaos of medieval combat is more than just a historical curiosity. It's a tribute to human resilience and creativity. And that's exactly why medieval shield making continues to capture imaginations on YouTube and beyond, trending under keywords like medieval shield making, how medieval shields were made, DIY medieval shield, medieval weapons, and survival history, fueling channels, documentaries, and entire communities dedicated to keeping the past alive. So here's what I want to know from you after discovering the secrets behind medieval shields. Would you ever try building your own DIY medieval shield? Or maybe you'd rather leave that to the blacksmiths and craftsmen of the past? Drop a comment below and tell me whether you'd trust your life to your own handmade shield, or if you'd rather stick to modern body armor. Because your thoughts could be the spark for future videos diving even deeper into medieval weapons, medieval armor, or the hidden stories behind the tools that once decided the fate of nations. And if you found this deep dive fascinating, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more epic journeys into survival history, and share this video with anyone who thinks shields are just boring wooden boards. Because the next time someone asks how medieval shields were made, you'll know the truth: they were built from sweat, blood, and a stubborn refusal to let death win. And who knows, in our next video, we might just crack open the secrets of how medieval swords were forged to clash against those very shields, revealing yet another chapter in the endless saga of medieval warfare and human ingenuity waiting to be brought back to life. And that, my friends, is the astonishing truth behind medieval shield making a story of survival history written in wood grain, hide glue, and hammered iron, proving that even in the blood-soaked chaos of medieval warfare, human ingenuity never stopped fighting for another dawn. And if there's one lesson to carry forward, it's this: the shield in your life might not be made of linden wood or wrapped in rawhide. But whether you're facing swords, setbacks, or just the relentless stress of modern living, it's the small details, the careful choices, and the courage to keep crafting solutions that stand between you and disaster. Because in medieval times, mistakes didn't just cost pride, they cost blood. And that's why knowing how medieval shields were made isn't just a glimpse into the past. It's a reminder that resilience is built one careful stroke at a time. And if you're sitting there thinking, could I ever build my own DIY medieval shield? Remember this: it's not just about wood and iron, it's about refusing to let life split you in two when the blows start raining down. So if this dive into medieval shield making sparked even a spark of fascination, hit that like button. Save this video for the next time you're craving medieval wisdom, and smash that subscribe so you'll never miss the secrets we're about to unlock in future adventures into medieval weapons, medieval combat, and survival history. And before you go, drop me a comment below. Would you trust your life to your own handmade shield, or would you rather face battle empty-handed than risk a DIY disaster? Your answer might just become the inspiration for the next video. Because in this community, history isn't dead. It's the sharpest weapon we've got. And remember, sometimes the only difference between splinters and survival is knowing how to build your own shield.